Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 24th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before, as always, we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way we keep it going, the way I pay the editor and my assistant Noelle, is through, mostly, honestly, through contributions from listeners just like you. I also sell ads from time to time, but as you'll see in this week's episode, there are no ads. And, we don't always sell out the show. So this week is fully funded by you, the listeners, who pledge your support at patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top supporters include Leonard Prince, Krister Jansen, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, I think, sorry about that, Thomas Sedovic, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Pasquale Gelati, Patrick Flynn, Brian Holden, David Compton, Dudas Infinitas, Joe Wilkinson, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, so let's dive into this week's episode. It's a fun one. I don't often talk to kids authors on the show. This time I had the opportunity to talk to somebody who wrote a new children's book, but hold that thought. She's also a really badass structural engineer. She's Indian, British American. She's based out of London, I think. And she has worked on some really big, impressive engineering projects like the Shard. She also wrote a book for adults already, sort of the adult version of this title, which you can buy right now, called Built: The Hidden Stories Behind Our Structures. But she was here to promote her new book, which is a kid version of that book that she wrote, and it was illustrated by Katie Hickey. It's called How Was That Built? The Stories Behind Awesome Structures. We talk a lot about structural engineering. How is it different from architecture? What is involved in structural engineering? And if this is something that you'd be interested in pursuing, how would you go about doing it? So without any further ado, here she is, Roma Agrawal. Well, Roma, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's such a joy to be here.
I'm really excited every time a children's book that's very STEM friendly, very STEM heavy. And honestly, I don't even know how to say this, but feels like it's a very kind of adult children's book. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but whenever something like that comes across my desk, I'm always thrilled because I know so many of my listeners have kids themselves and are really interested in making sure that they're raising kids who appreciate the scientific method, who appreciate evidence, who are excited by science and technology and engineering and math. So your book is just right in that wheelhouse. So I was really excited to get you on the show.
Oh, thank you. No, it's such a joy to be here. And I actually wrote the adult version first, which is called Built: The Hidden Stories Behind Our Structures. And then the publisher said, well, maybe we need to do a kid's version of it. So I've got material that works at every level.
I love that so much. And you before you wrote these books, I mean, I shouldn't say before, but as a career, you work as a structural engineer. Is that correct?
Yes, so I did till about 2 years ago, and I wrote Built and How Was That Built while I was still working as an engineer. So that was quite a busy time. And yeah, I mean, I felt like the job I did was so fascinating and so interesting. And I would go on holiday, and even around London where I live and where I'm based, I would just look around at buildings and bridges and kind of try to picture what was under my feet. And I just felt like that might be a picture of the world that's missing from a lot of people's consciousness. And really the reason I wrote the books was to try and, encourage people to explore that a little bit more.
Absolutely. And so what is it? I mean, I think for those listening, it's so common on especially science-based or STEM-based shows. Even when we talk about STEM in general, I feel like we talk a lot about the S, maybe a bit about the T, maybe a tiny bit about the M. The engineering often is not part of the conversation. And so I'm really just thrilled anytime I have the opportunity to have an engineer on the show, especially an engineer who is a woman, an engineer who is a woman of color. It's just an area that I feel like we don't spend enough time in. And there's such a wealth of potential career opportunities for kiddos who are getting excited to think about what they want to do with their lives. And so maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what a structural engineer actually does.
Yes, so structural engineers, in short and simple terms, are responsible for making that buildings and bridges stand up. So, wherever you might be listening to this podcast, whether you're in your home or in an office, maybe you're on the move, going through stations or something, the reason that those things are not collapsing on you is because somebody like me worked out what all the forces are on that structure and then figured out what materials are the best materials for that structure and then made sure there's enough material in all the right places to make a beautiful thing that we can live and work in.
And so there's this combination that you have to have expertise in. It's not just physics, but it's also material science, and it's also aesthetics. It's also mathematics. You really need to know all of these or have skills in all of these areas because they all play together in order to make a building, like you said, or a bridge or a subway tunnel, whatever you're working on, not collapse on itself.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I really enjoy about being a structural engineer is, just as you said, there are lots and lots of different types of skills and knowledge that all come together. And I also love the fact that we work so much with people from all different disciplines. So whether that's architects or mechanical engineers or electrical engineers or cost consultants or acoustic consultants, there's this huge plethora of people that have to work together to make a building work. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about structures is that they're incredibly complex pieces of engineering. But I think because we're so used to them and so used to seeing them everywhere, right from the time that we're born, maybe we take them for granted a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. So I'd love some clarification. You mentioned mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. I feel like the within the title, it's a little bit self-explanatory, but you also mentioned architects. And I can imagine that there's probably some confusion between like, what is an architect and what is a structural engineer? How are they different from one another?
Yeah, this is one of those funny things where people often ask me if I'm an architect. I'm like, no, I'm a structural engineer. They're different. So it's definitely one of those discussions. I think that's really important to have. The way I see it is that the architects hold the overall vision for a project. So they, have a piece of land that they've been asked to look at. They think about the context of what they want to build there. They'll think about that particular block, but they'll also zoom out and look at that neighborhood and maybe the district and the city. And, they've got this kind of big picture vision. And then they also understand, how many people will be in the building. What is it going to look like? Some idea of what materials they want to use. What is a social contribution that structure might enable in that particular area. So there's a lot of things, and then they do really, really detailed things like where the staircases should go, are the stairs the right width and the depth, and like right down to that kind of level. And then there's basically this team of other people, a lot of them engineers, who have to kind of take that vision. And the way I describe it is putting bones into the flesh. So structural engineers are basically looking at this vision and saying, well, how can I put the bones and the skeleton in to make sure that the structure stands up, it's safe, it's robust, it can resist all these forces. So it's a very, very collaborative relationship that we have. We have to work together. It can be a joy. It can also be frustrating when we've got slightly different ideas about how to make things work. But I think the best pieces of, architectural engineering come out when we work together right from the beginning and in a really, really collaborative way.
I love that. I almost like the parallels that I'm kind of coming to, and maybe they're not perfect analogies, but it has to do with some of the work that I've done in the past, thinking about kind of like the film and television industry. It's almost like the architect is the one directing the project, and then all the different engineers are the ones who are actually producing it. They're the ones who are like making it come to fruition, and the director has like the big picture and ensures that all the different parts work together to be pleased with what the final product really is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great analogy. I might have to steal that one.
But then, of course, I guess that requires that people know the difference between a director and a producer as well.
I guess that's true.
Yeah. So, it's interesting that you transitioned then from writing a book for an adult audience, still a trade publication, right? So a book for like a public consumption, but for an adult audience where you really dug deep into all of these incredible engineering feats, throughout the city and focused on specific pieces, but also just how things like skyscrapers work, how things like, bridges and tunnels work. And then as you mentioned, your publishers were like, let's do a kid's book. So a kid's book is obviously much more visual than an adult book. And of course, this lends itself to a visual medium. So tell me about the experience saying, how do we translate? I mean, obviously there's still words in a kid's book. You wrote the words, but how do you also translate that to a visual medium?
Yeah, so in my adult book, there are some really simple kind of blackline sketches that I did myself just to explain some of the trickier engineering or physics concepts, but also to bring some of the structures to life. But what I did was, I've got like a sketch of the Shard, a photograph of the Shard or a photograph of the Taipei 101 tower. And I've annotated that in my own handwriting, to encourage the reader to look beyond the outside glass of a structure or whatever. So, even the adult book required a little bit of visual communication, and I think it's a better book for it. And then the other really interesting thing is that in terms of obviously the number of words, the kids' book has far fewer words than the grown-up version, but the tone and the level of language is not that different. Because ultimately, the jargon, the terminology that we use, that's not going to be familiar to adults or children. And so it's up to me to kind of demystify that and deconstruct that a little bit. And what I wanted to do with both books is to make sure that I'm covering some science, some history, and obviously some engineering, but also some people. So I think the biggest task for the children's book was really honing down what the core messages are that I want to get across. How can I do that in the fewest words possible? And how can I keep that texture that I had in my adult book with all those kind of different genres or styles of writing? And then, Katie Hickey, who was the illustrator, had never done an engineering book before. Her dad is an engineer, so she's kind of been around that world and she gets it. But she found this a great challenge, and I think she had a lot of fun with it. And what I loved about the fact that she hadn't really done engineering books in the past was she came to it with a fresh idea, and I think she brought a lot of warmth to the illustrations, a bit of humor, a bit of cheekiness and silliness. And I think that combination of, her style of illustration and what can be seen or perceived as quite a dry technical subject, I think is what works really well with the children's book.
Oh, yeah. And I love that it has almost gosh, I know I'm not going to be able to find my words right now, but there is a narrative structure within it, but the narrative structure is sort of included within these individual pieces. Like you can literally flip to any page and learn something new if you like, because they're kind of self-contained. And I really love that about kids' books very often, about coffee table books, about art books, that you can kind of open up a spread, gain a lot of knowledge from that spread, and then close it and open up a different spread on a different day or a different night. Or you can read it cover to cover, and it sort of makes sense both ways.
Yes. So you can absolutely do that. And then the third little thing you can do with my particular book is you can read them in chunks of 3 spreads. So I almost had this, obviously I'd written Built, which is the adult book, and I had a process for structuring, and yes, that's a pun, for structuring that book. But with the children's book, I approached it quite differently. So whereas with the adult book, you probably do need to read it sequentially to build up that picture of these are forces, these are then materials, these then go into more and more complex structures as you get further into the book. With the children's book, I flipped it round and essentially selected 11 structures from around the world. And I picked structures from every continent, which I'm very proud of. And then I thought about all the different materials science, the engineering, and the people that I wanted to include in the book, and basically found a way to kind of slot all of that information under the 11 headline structures. So it's almost like every set of 3 spreads within that structure has then got its whole story from, quite a broad perspective. And so that basically, like you say, allows parents and children to just dip in and out as they find comfortable and come back to it whenever they feel like it.
And it's so lovely how you, instead of sort of, you subheaded them with the names of the structures, but the actual kind of chapters or units or chunks or whatever you want to call it, you picked a feature that is like a striking feature about each of these structures. So how to build tall, how to build long, how to build in the sea, how to build on ice, which is just so simple and whimsical, but also so brilliant. Because I think sometimes we tend, with our adult minds, to overcomplicate and to focus sometimes on the forest sometimes on the trees instead of the forest. And what a simple way to describe these different features of these structures that are so wildly different, but do have underlying principles to all of them.
Yeah, I want to pretend that it all worked out beautifully and it was all really planned and simple, but I think that was one of the hardest parts of putting the book together, and rightly so. I think often when we talk about STEM and when you come across STEM writing, and I'm not talking about mine, I'm talking about other amazing writers, the people that succeed are the ones that make it look effortless and seemingly simple, and then you kind of delve into this joyous world that underpins it all. And what I started with was trying to pick structures that were all different. So I wanted, for example, a bridge, a skyscraper, a building, a historical one, a modern one, a tunnel or whatever. And then between those and then the countries, the 7 continents and then the people and so on, I basically ended up with this huge jumble of stuff, which I slowly managed to unpick. And then we started, me and my editors, when we were reviewing all this stuff, said, well, when, children ask why all the time. And we want to be able to essentially answer that question, why or how? Like, how do you build a tunnel and why do you do it this way? And that's why we then created this theme, which is basically kind of, like you say, these questions across the book. So if you've got a particular question that you want answered, you can just go to that page and hopefully find your response.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. And how was it for you? I mean, this is just like my curiosity here, a little bit inside baseball, but I have friends who write, they're science writers and they're journalists and they write for public consumption. And sometimes they write kids pieces, and they have all sorts of tools that they use. Like I feel like there's some sort of software program you can use where you put in your writing and it sort of tells you what grade level you're writing at, and you can tweak it in order to like bring it up or down to the exact appropriate grade level. Like, how difficult or easy or interesting was it for you to try and get your writing at the right level for children's brains?
I wish I'd heard of that software 3.5 years ago.
Oh no!
But this is good for me because I'm probably going to write another children's book, so this is useful information.
Oh yeah, I'll get you the name of it. I'll ask right now while we're recording.
That's fabulous. It surprised me. And I'm almost lost for words here. It surprised me because I wrote Built and I broke down the language. And of course, it's not like I'm trying to patronize adults, but, to make the engineering sound accessible and engaging and exciting, I broke it down to a particular level. And for the children's book, I only had to break it down a tiny little bit more because kids are really smart and they ask really, really difficult questions. To be honest, the presentations I find the most nerve-wracking are when I've got a room full of 5 or 6 year olds. That even the teenagers are less terrifying because they've got a slight filter, and adults are fine. But they ask really challenging questions. They want to know new words and big words. And, my 3-year-old the other day just said fabulous and terrible. And I'm like, wow, she's just absorbing all this words and all this language. So I had a crack at it. And it was in collaboration with Bloomsbury, with my editors, that, we kind of tweaked things back and forth a little bit. And actually, we decided that the level of language we wanted to use wasn't that far off the adult books. So it wasn't too onerous for me, actually. I think what was more challenging was bringing it down, like bringing the word count down.
Oh, right. Just using fewer words so that you could fill the page with so much art.
Exactly. So you've got particular stories you want to tell, and whereas in the adult version, a chapter might have been 6,000 or 7,000 words long, over here it's going to be maximum 1,000, if that. And so that really forced me to think very hard about what's the essence of the story, what is the core message I'm trying to get across, and then focusing in on that. So I think that for me was the biggest challenge.
It's really like, I don't know, it sounds like such a fun, probably frustrating at times, but such a fun challenge to put on yourself in a world where, like, when do you ever get to or have to do that? There's such interesting creative constraints that you're putting on yourself to produce something like this, that I can imagine you really gained a lot from it. Like, that those skills are really translatable in the future for you.
I think it's one of the most important skills that I've picked up as an engineer. And it was a skill that I started to develop a little bit into my career, so maybe 5 or 6 years into my career. And actually, I now say to up and coming engineers that this is the most important skill. And to be clear about what I mean, it's about being able to break down complex technical principles, ideas, hypotheses, jargon, and being able to communicate that clearly and in an engaging way to people who aren't engineers. So when I described this process of putting a building or a bridge together earlier, and I talked about all these different professionals that I have to work with, or any engineer works with, they don't know as much about structures as I do or my colleagues do. So we still need to break the language down when communicating with all of these other people. And being able to do that effectively means that your ideas can be taken on board more effectively. Because I might have the most genius idea about how to solve something, but if I then communicate that to the client or to the architect or the cost consultant in a way that they don't understand, I might as well not have had the idea in the first place. So I actually think that it is really, really, really hard, but I think it's an absolutely vital skill that the next generation of engineers should be aspiring to.
And I love the way that you described it. I love the language that you used. I think back to times when I was working in television and doing a lot of like presenting, like broadcast presenting, and science was always my beat. And people, producers who maybe were like a little bit naive to working within science, or just didn't really understand that concept in their bones the way that I think that you and I do, would often use that phrasing that I absolutely hate, which I'm sure you hate as well, where they would be like, just dumb it down. And it like hurt my soul, because whenever I teach science communication, I very often I have these like 5 or 6 principles that I teach, and one of them is never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but always underestimate their vocabulary. Like, they don't know the words, and why would they? It's not their field. They don't need the shorthand.
I think that's a really succinct way to explain it. I think people have a lot of understanding and information that they're absorbing from the world all the time. But if you talk about finite element analysis, then that doesn't make any sense. So, why use that term? Explain it in a way that's accessible.
Yeah. And it also, not only does it not make sense, I think it also makes people afraid that they don't have the cognitive capacity. Like, you see this quite often where people, I don't get that, I'm going to shut down. I mean, I had it when I was a child in school. I had the classic kind of women in STEM problem where all of the social forces were telling me that boys are better at math and engineering. And I was really into science when I was very young. And then there was that age that happens to a lot of girls where they're like, I guess this isn't for me. This is probably going to be too hard for me. You're using words I don't understand. And it becomes this like negative feedback, self-perpetuating cycle where now it sounds too hard. I put up a cognitive block. I can't get past that cognitive block. And then it's almost like a reflection of personal failure. I don't get it. I'm never going to get it. I'm not smart enough to get it. Instead of, no. It's just, we've got to shift the way that we approach it a little bit and make it more accessible.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think, putting people off science and engineering is to our detriment. And I think we've seen a lot of that during the whole COVID situation when, we're in this health crisis. And if, doctors, medical professionals, people that work in the field, whether they're engineers or technicians or mathematics, they're modeling data, statistics. If we can't, communicate to the general public who might not have that vocabulary, what's happening, it can affect our lives. And, that really, really came to the forefront, I think, with the COVID pandemic. And hopefully that's going to encourage us to make sure that, we keep working on this particular skill.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's such a cool thing that children are such a good model for that, because we have this weird relationship with how we view children intellectually. It's like, on the one hand, I think there's this stereotype or this bias that kids, like, they just, they're too naive. They don't know enough about the world. Like, you've got to talk down to them. You've got to belittle them, which is so insane, because any parent knows, and I'm not even a parent, but I work in psychology and I work with children quite a lot, knows that kids, because they're so dialed into their academic worlds and because they're such kind of sponges, you can ask them about things that parents don't know anything about, and they've got more baseline knowledge because they're like, oh yeah, I remember learning about the American Revolution or learning about the, fill in the blank. And it's amazing how we have this very, I don't know how to put it, it's like a paradoxical relationship to what we think kids are capable of. Like, on the one hand, we expect so much of them, and on the other hand, we treat them like they don't know anything.
Again, that's such an interesting way that you've put that. I have a 3-year-old, and it is my firm belief, even before I had her and saw other children playing, and with all the school's engagement work and everything that I did, that every single child is an engineer. Every single child is a scientist. They want to discover their world. My daughter was crawling around, touching everything, licking things, putting stuff in her mouth. It's because they want to experience that sensory feeling of, what is it that I'm touching? Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it cold or warm? Or is it rough or smooth? And what happens if I open this up? And what if I break this? And she unfortunately went through a phase where she used to throw stuff around to see what would happen.
Right.
I was like, I like the science of this, but please don't touch my vase. That might not end very well for any of us. And, there's a very natural curiosity that all of us are born with. And for me, it's about nurturing that and making sure that that curiosity remains, and that we don't just get so caught up in exams and tests and scoring and all of that kind of things that a lot of education systems unfortunately put onto children. How do we keep that curiosity alive, so that even when we're grown-ups, even if we're not STEM professionals, even if we're not in the world of STEM, we can still have an interest and curiosity about it, just like probably you and me like listening to music or reading books. So we're interested in literature and other topics outside of STEM. So how can we make sure that people who aren't in STEM still have that curiosity and, basic interest nurtured?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the point that you made there about how children naturally have this very, like, engineering mind. I think we do beat it out of them very often as they get older. But I'm curious if that paralleled your own path into becoming a structural engineer. Like, were you a very engineering focused child? Was it something that you sort of left and came back to? Or did you kind of always have those, I guess, proclivities and interests?
Yeah, probably somewhere between the latter things you said. So I have an engineer dad and a kind of mathematician coder mum. And she gave up working once I was born, like in the 1980s. So we lived in the US, and she was a coder in 1980s America, which was super cool. And dad, when we moved back to India, gave up his engineering career and looked after the family business. So that that grounding's always been there. We used to spend a lot of time playing with Lego and Meccano and different building blocks and cranes and all sorts of stuff. So I think our visual skills were always nurtured. And then the education system in India, at least in the time that I was there in school, was very science focused, because culturally in India, parents want their kids to become doctors, accountants, engineers. Those are the professions that are well paid, that are respected. It's a privilege to be in those professions. And so that was, again, the kind of context in which I was growing up, although the education, I think, was a bit more sort of rote learning. And I think also slightly to the detriment of my writing skills, which is why I never thought I could write until I forced myself to learn in my 30s. We didn't really learn creative writing and things in the way that I now think, wow, I wish I had learned these things when I was at school. So that underlying thing was always there. I always loved science, particularly physics. I didn't love chemistry. Biology I was kind of okay with. And then I moved to the UK and decided to study maths and physics and design, and then went on to do a degree in physics. So through this process, I didn't know what I actually wanted to do as a career, but I knew that if I studied physics, then I could, enter quite a range of professions. And then it was, partway through my physics degree that I thought, oh my goodness, I really love the idea of engineering, and I should look into this a little bit more. It's one of those classic things where even though I grew up in such an engineering sort of culture and household, it never really occurred to me that I could be an engineer as a profession. It's a really strange thing. And so that was something I had to kind of flip to when I was in my 20s. So I actually came to it quite late in that sense.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There's so much to unpack there that's like personal. You think about like the nature and nurture of it all, the kind of biopsychosocial components of it all. And of course, that's my approach because I'm coming from psychology. That's my field. But how especially girls are raised, how different cultures, what is your family dynamic like? What are your expectations? What are the toys that are given to you that you see on the shelves? Are they pink? Are they blue? All of these things play in, but there is almost this like fundamental thing where kids, like you were saying earlier, kids like put things in their mouths because they want to see what they feel like. And like that's not gender specific, and it's not age. Well, I guess it is age specific, but it's not culture bound at all. Like kids want to explore.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. And I think, I have to still often go to the boys section to buy clothes with diggers and like engineering themed stuff for my daughter, or space themed stuff. And it really, really frustrates me. I actually named my daughter after the first module of the International Space Station. So in the book, if you kind of flip to the space spread, there's like a spacecraft, and there's a Russian word on there, and that's her name.
Oh, I love that so
like
much.
Just a little subtle nod to my daughter. But that's I chose the nerdiest name for her, and when I told people that this is what I've named her, and so it's Zarya, which means dawn in Russian, and it was the first module of the International Space Station, then people started buying her space-themed gifts. And I was like, yes, this is great. At least this is a good way to get people to get, I don't know, a range of stuff for her. And it is something I'm really, really conscious of. We tend to read more to girls, but we tend to do fewer kind of puzzles and 3D visual games with girls. And then if you keep doing that, for a number of years, then you get to the kind of middle school and high school ages. And then you get to the situation that you described, which is like, oh yeah, that's not really for me. And I'm just really, really conscious that I want her to make a very active choice about what she decides to do. And that should be a kind of, this is my interest, not I have been lacking the exposure to these particular skills or techniques or whatever, and that's why STEM doesn't feel like it's for me. So there's quite a kind of tricky balance to strike, I think.
Yeah, because it's like you want children to follow and pursue the things that they are interested in, but their environment, their culture, their all the things that we surround them with, their society has to be somewhat egalitarian in that. They're not going to know that there are options if those options aren't made readily available. And one of the things that you see quite a lot, I mean, this is more of like a psychology, sociology perspective, is that even in little girls who are interested in these things, very often, because of the way that we socialize boys and girls to speak, to share their emotions, to walk around, to have confidence, teachers call on boys more in classes like science and math and boys tend to have more confidence in their answers. And so when their hands shoot up first and when they say their answers more confidently, there's this self-perpetuating loop where the teachers reinforce that behavior. Whereas girls are like, I'm grappling with this a little bit. I'm not really sure of myself. I don't know if I'm going to be right and I don't want to be wrong in front of the rest of the classroom. They may be more reticent to speak, even if their understanding is at the exact same level. And it becomes this really sadly negative and self-perpetuating problem where the confidence level just drops and drops and drops, and the stereotype threat goes up and up and up. And it's so sad that you see this play out in classrooms literally across the world.
100%. And that's why I think it's so important that all of us learn about biases and think about our biases and the language we're using. And I have to work hard when I'm reading books to her to make sure that, because a lot of the books just have male characters, and I'll often change the pronouns or, calling, all the tigers in books are generally he's. And, so it's just so ingrained in everything that we do. But it's not just for children. I always remember this event that I spoke at, which was for International Women's Day. And they invited people of all genders to attend the talk. I think about 85% of the audience was women, and there was, a few men there. And when it came to question time, the first three questions or the first three hands that went up were men. And I had to say, hold on a second. I've just answered three questions from men about International Women's Day, and that's brilliant. I really want men to be engaged. But I also want to hear from the women. What are you thinking? What are you hesitating to ask me? So I said, I need to take three questions from women and then we'll take it from there. So yeah, it's we have to keep fighting against them.
And these defaults, like you were talking about, like all the tigers in the books having male names. I had this brilliant, and it wasn't planned or anything, but we were doing a live recording of another podcast I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And we were talking about exactly what you're saying, these deeply ingrained biases that are so prevalent that you don't even notice that they exist, and sort of what is the default and how do we flip the script. And something that came up were the signs for bathrooms. And I remember saying, because I was there were women in the audience, but that podcast is like 4 men and me. So I was like, why is it? It reminded me, and I've mentioned this on the show before, but I used to go to this one gym and the trainers at the gym had these like posters on the wall. And it always made me furious because there was a poster of like a man, and it was like his musculoskeletal system, right? Like a medical poster. And it said, the musculoskeletal system. And then next to it, there was a woman, and it said, the female musculoskeletal system. And I was like, oh, so the man is the default. We don't have to say male. That's the norm. And then the female is the other, right? So I was like, oh, this is such an example of that. And then I was thinking about bathroom signs, and the male is the person. There's nothing male about the person. It's just person. But the female is wearing a skirt. And so I was like, and everybody in the audience was like, yeah, but what would be the alternative be? And I was like, I don't know, put a mustache on the guy. Like, why is it like they both are people and then the man has a mustache? Like, why do we always default to the woman being other? And it's so ingrained that, I don't know, it's just a whole thing. We have to think about these things. And clearly you're raising a little girl, so you really have to think about those things. And when I look at your book, you have, a spread on Emily Warren. You have so many female characters that are highlighted in your book. Like, there's a thoughtfulness to how the drawings are made. There's a thoughtfulness to the faces on the people, to how they're dressed, to the color of their skin. And this is something that, sadly, I think you don't see enough when it's not a woman, and especially a woman of color, who is at the helm.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that came across to you when you were reading it, because it is something that me and Katie worked really hard on. And I mentioned the 7 continents thing a few times, and the reason that's really important to me is also defaulting to the West, like, oh, the best structures, the most interesting engineering is in the West. Because, when we studied physics or engineering at university or even at school, most of the scientists and engineers we studied were white men from the West, and not the incredible, people that, visionaries from, say, India or China or Japan or South America or wherever else. So it was incredibly important to me that I made the book as diverse as possible in every sense. So geographically, in terms of race and nationality, in terms of gender, and so on. And I'm so glad that came across. And so even the engineers gallery, which is the kind of last page at the back, that was a really fun exercise for me, going, I have all the power and I can decide who goes into this. And I had a bit of fun with that.
I love that. That's so great. And yes, the people that you highlight are just so varied, and so, not white men. and I appreciate that so much. I got to ask you, Roma, like you mentioned that, you were working, and you're quite young. You were working as wait, are we the same age?
Maybe, I don't know.
Were you born in 1983?
Yes.
Yeah, we're the same age. That's amazing. I love it. Yeah, because I was seeing your degrees and I was like, oh yeah, we got our degrees around the same time. Yeah, that makes sense. And so it's funny, I was looking at your Wikipedia page and one of the tags at the bottom is 1983 births. I was like, oh, interesting. You're still quite young and early in your career, but you were saying you were working as a structural engineer. Now you're focusing on writing. And now I'm wondering what's next for you. Like, where do you see your career heading?
That is a very existential question.
Well, I am an existential psychotherapist, so it makes sense that I would have asked that.
I don't know is the answer at the moment. So I wrote Built while I was working. I didn't have kids at the time, so I was working 4 days a week and then wrote this book like on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays or in evenings, and that was not a good balance. And then I wrote How Was That Built while I was pregnant, which was a really hard time for me because I've talked about this openly in the past, but I went through IVF and had a very anxious pregnancy. So it was a really kind of fraught, difficult time. And I remember I basically finished my text just before my daughter was born. And then, Katie took it away and worked on it, and it came out, a couple of years ago in the UK now, but more recently in the US. So that was a really difficult time for me. And then I had my daughter and I was on maternity leave and I was bored. I didn't find, feeding and changing nappies a very brain stimulating activity. I don't think most people do. My husband was at home with us for 3 months and then I was on my own with her for about 3 or 4 months.
Wonderful though.
Yeah. So we decided that we would try and have as much equity as we could in the situation. So I started writing book proposals while I was on maternity leave. My mental health was also in a bad phase. So, again, I've talked about my postpartum depression in some other podcasts. And I signed a book deal in March 2020, which, as you'll recall, was the time the world imploded.
Yep.
And I asked to work for an extra 12 months, of an unpaid sabbatical, because I said between the pandemic, me just coming back from maternity leave, I've just signed a book deal, everyone's working online, I can't see how I'm going to make all of this work. Working from home and all this stuff, no help. So I decided to take a sabbatical, and then later I quit my job. And I just said, let me give myself a year and see how it goes. And that was 2 years ago. And I've been busy and working hard on my next book, which is called Nuts and Bolts.
Mm-hmm.
That comes out next year in the UK and in the US, which I'm really, really excited about. And I'm probably going to do a kids version of this one as well, which is super exciting. So that's, my next immediate project. But, the bigger question of what else I want to do in my career, I think what I want to do is to think about the engineering profession and the way we as people interact with engineering on the big picture level and see where I can have some influence there. That sounds like a big nebulous topic, but an example would be towards the end of Nuts and Bolts, which is a new book. I talk a little bit about why we should understand the nuts and bolts of our stuff, the small bits of our stuff, and about this culture of throwing away electronics, for example, when they stop working. And the UK is the biggest culprit, per person. We're throwing away 24 kilograms of electronic waste per year.
Really? Worse than the US? That's surprising
it's
to
worse
me.
than the US, but not by much, but it's
Right, okay.
worse than the US.
Yeah.
I think the US is like 21 kilos and we're like 24 kilos or something. And so maybe that's something to explore, is how can we get people more engaged with engineering so that when something breaks, they're like, I have no idea what to do with this. But maybe instead say, actually, let me open this up and just look at the different parts and see if I can figure out what's not working and if I can fix it. And I think that creates so much more of a human connection with technology. But there you go. Those are random, unformed thoughts going through my head at the minute.
I love it. And kind of to take that last one that you were making, I think so there's the extreme version where somebody, learns more about science and engineering and where, their iPhone breaks and they go, okay, I'm interested. I'm going to open this up and see and if I can fix it. Of course, yes, some people might be able to do that. But I think there's also the in-between, which is probably the most important takeaway, which is if you're mindful and you're thinking about the fact that there are rare earth metals and there are, silicon chips and there are things in here that are useful and necessary that we have to mine that are difficult to get our hands on, that when you know this in your bones, when something like that breaks, you don't throw it in the trash. You go, how do I send this to a place where they're going to be able to recycle and scrap and utilize this? Or what are the different outlets that I can donate these materials to, where I know that they're going to be responsible in how they use these materials? And it just being that part of the chain, you almost need a bit of appreciation, which comes from a bit of knowledge, in order to think that way.
Yeah, and I think it really ties in well with what we were talking before about the nature-nurture thing and gender and nationality and race and social mobility with STEM. It's about awareness, and I think that's what I think the biggest message that I'd like to give out is to be curious. So whenever I sign the kids' book, I always say, stay curious, because I know you're already curious, so just stay that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even if it's stuff that you might not think is immediately interesting to you or that might feel intimidating to you, just asking a couple more questions like kids do the whole time might, kind of send you down some really interesting paths, and you never know what you might discover.
Absolutely. I love that. Okay. Well, Roma, before we finish up, every time I have a new guest on the show, I ask them the same two closing questions. And like earlier, you're like, that's very existential. So get ready, because these are probably even more so. Take all the time you need to think. We have the power of the edit. So the two questions are big picture questions. I want you to think about the future, and you can think about it in whatever context feels relevant to you. It could be personal, familial, it could be community, it could be vocational, it could be social, cultural, global, cosmic, whatever. First, I want you to tell me, what is the thing that has been keeping you up the most at night? The thing you're most concerned about? Maybe you're feeling pessimism, even some cynicism, but where are you really like, worried? And then on the flip side of that, when you think about the future, how are you maintaining your hope and your optimism? What are you sort of genuinely looking forward to?
Yeah, talk about existential.
Right.
I think the things that worry me at the moment are, I guess, the political situation that a lot of countries around the world have found themselves in. The divide, the lack of compassion, the lack of kindness, the lack of understanding. And I would really like to see that coming closer together, or even being able to have conversations with people that you might disagree with or might not have the same views as, but being able to do that in a kind and compassionate way. And I think we're struggling with that at the moment. So that worries me from a kind of human point of view. And then, I mean, also from a human point of view, but also the planet point of view, I think the issue of waste that, we've talked about a little bit, particularly resonates with me. I mean, obviously there's carbon emissions, there's lots of different ways the planet's being affected. But the waste thing just resonates with me because it's technology that we are creating. That's what engineers do, is we create stuff. And so then I start asking my question, but well, should we be creating this stuff? And should we be kind of aspiring to the most technologically advanced fridge or whatever? Or should we be kind of going back to basics a little bit and thinking about what we actually need and what does that look like? So I think those are the things that I struggle with. And in terms of the things that make me optimistic, I think there's two things. One is young people. So, just the wonderful qualities that I see in young people today. And also I see my daughter, the way she's being educated, she's being taught about bodily consent right from the time she was a few months old. Like, if you don't like something, you say, I don't like this, and the other person needs to stop.
Yeah. We did not have that when we were kids.
We did not.
Yeah.
And, we're teaching her to talk about her feelings. So what we talk about when she's sad or when she's angry or frustrated, when she's happy, and why she feels those feelings. So from that perspective, and also the fact, that I feel like younger people today talk more about mental health. They're more climate conscious than we were. That gives me hope. So that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is science and engineering and STEM as a general topic. I just think when humans come together and really put their minds to something, I mean, the International Space Station is such a wonderful example of this, where the Russians, the Americans, and the Japanese came together, and plus lots of other people, Europeans, and so on, to create a home for humans away from our planet. And if we kind of come away from the politics and the wrangling and all of that kind of stuff and come down to the human level, the science level, we can work together and achieve incredible things. And so I wonder whether that's the way that we'll be able to come, closer together as a global world that we live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Roma, gosh, this has been such an enlightening and I think just exciting chat today. I feel really motivated. I feel really, I don't know, sometimes at the end of the last two questions, I kind of find myself in a pretty dark place, but I'm feeling really hopeful. And I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate the incredible work that you do. And I really do wish you all the best as you continue on this incredible journey. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
No, and right back at you. Thank you for asking me such wonderful, thoughtful questions. It's been a real joy. Thank you.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.